In the end, everything is a gag. Sid tried to convey the idea that he was some Carlos Castaneda of the flesh, that there were mysteries he could reveal regarding the charm of bondage that straight people either denied or were blind to. He expounded on an arcane philosophy of giving women power by tying them up. Because I'd had production experience working around studios, he'd offered me a job as a minor and part-time villain in some of his little movies. It would be safe enough. I knew that Sid wouldn't cross over into my normal life, and I knew that none of the women I knew would ever be interested in working with Sid. The technical term for this degree of innocence is called hubris. Within a period of 6 months, half a dozen women I knew were working for Sid. It was barely the 80s. Reagan was president, Belushi and Lennon were fresh dead, disco and polyester ruled the club scene, and AIDS was still a novelty. In a darkened, sprawling underground warehouse at the edge of some unnamed city, I helped Sid make it look real. And for some people, if it looks real, it is real. There's a parallel to the audience reaction at the turn of the century to the great train robbery in which the actor fires a shot directly at the camera. This caused pandemonium among the Nickelodeons of the country as people gasped or fainted or jumped out of the way of the bullet. A modern look at the bad boys in cinema would make this reaction seem quaint. But here at the ass end of the 20th century, people are still trying to rewrite laws based on their alarmed guesses of what constitutes reality. At some level, of course, it is real, since Sid's work was about sex and money, which are both real and abstract. Enough money can buy anything, no matter how twisted, perverse, or ostentatious. My provincialism let me be surprised that the girl next door would strip naked in a warehouse with a couple of men she'd never met before for $200. Now, jaded like everyone else, I realize there will always be a Betty Page. There will always be an Irving Klaw. There will always be an Estes Kefauver with a gavel and a committee to keep them underground where the real delicacies are found, like gold and truffles. It is a law as rigidly enforced as gravity. During the course of our working together, Sid told me amazing stories about this industry whose eccentricities we serviced, about the appetites involved and the money available to feed those appetites. Some of this seemed a little more than fables designed to impress the unsophisticated novitiate, apocrypha, one associated with the mafia or the Illuminati or Arabs, all of whom figured frequently. He told me about a woman that he couldn't work with because she was too close to the edge to maintain the illusion that Sid required for his work. This suggests to me, more than anything else, that she is real. She entertained violent rape fantasies and would permit almost anything to be done to her. She had eroticized brutality through some arcane mechanism that puzzled even Sid. In the performance of her violent but wholly consensual fantasies, she could only get off, as they say, by having her labia stitched together with a sailmaker's needle and heavy thread. I never met her, but I did see women who liked to impale themselves on heavy polyurethane wooden dildos, projecting upwards from a chair seat, rocking back and forth in slow, almost religious ecstasy, veins standing out on their neck, bodies vibrating as if machines work between the flesh, fluids puddling in the chair and scenting the room with an aroma that was similar to the burning flesh one sometimes smells at freeway accidents. I was aware I was watching a profound pathology only remotely connected to sexuality. And Sid knew it too. All the same, with Sid at the rudder, we pressed deeper and deeper along this narrowing river into the moist jungle where Kurtz lived. And I began to understand that we were operating in a dimension that was only marginally adjacent to the one I was familiar with. A world that could only be illuminated and understood in fitful bursts. It was like war, neurosurgery, and rock and roll all at once. We looked inward upon it in our masks as the women swung before us in their webs of nylon ropes, glistening like spiders in a dream. Well, maybe it's not quite the same hallucinatory experience just hearing about it. You had to be there to understand it. It's like walking across hot coals, to see that it's possible to come into intimate contact with fire and not be burned by it. This was a world unknown to me, except for its theatrical aspects. That was the real world to me. But but I was endlessly fascinated by Sid's ability to mix the two. Creating realistic backgrounds in low-rent basements, Sid could toss off a couple of weeks' worth with 2x4 sheetrock, sheet paint, styrofoam, PVC pipe, and furniture on short-term rental, and produce half a dozen sets that looked like the backlot at Universal. Venetian blinds and drapes hung against blank walls, and because you expected a window to be there, you'd never know there wasn't one. No smoking signs in 3 languages and foreign dictatorships gave you the Mission Impossible feeling of being in some unnamed South American country. With Sid's attention to detail, you'd never know you weren't on the island of El Molestiado. Sid even created an urban diorama meant to be casually visible from the balcony of an apparent high-rise in some vaguely familiar metropolis. He sketched a skyline in false-fronted buildings lit with strings of Christmas lights, foam core pretending to be steel and glass, cardboard pretending to be Chicago or Istanbul. There was a hyper-reality to it all, like wandering backstage on Pirates of the Caribbean on acid. Especially since 2 hours later, I would be back at my apartment, back into my utterly ordinary life, drinking coffee and learning lines for another Neil Simon comedy, where the illusion of reality was never as critical nor so well achieved. In pursuit of said illusion, Sid granted me perks that I would have never gotten in a straighter workplace. As Sid's sorcerer's apprentice, I got to tear clothing to shreds and flog women with a doubled belt. The raw-looking stripes were applied with makeup and rubbed on the belt, and then rubber stamped across thighs and buttocks and breasts. Sid always did the makeup, since he was invariably better and faster at it than the women were. Needing to keep his hands clean to do makeups, costumes, load the cameras, tend to the paperwork, and script logs, Sid let me rub the naked bodies of the day's talent with mineral oil to make them look sweaty, although we usually kept heaters running during the shoot in the cable-like warehouse. Since this was a science project, not particularly a fantasy of mine, except for the naked girls, I was never aroused by any of them. I was half roadie, setting up stage, laying out the tripods and heavy orange electrical cables for the lights, and half lab assistant for this curious class in physics, setting up ropes and pulley systems. Sid and I worked with the same disinterested efficiency as any news crew preparing for a day with the mayor. I was a geek now, inside the tent. Sweaty-handed excitement was for the rubes who had never seen it before and thought it was real. I mean, even though my back was to the camera, anyone could tell I was unzipping my pants, the telltale masturbatory jiggle of an elbow, my head tilted back, that little shudder that must surely indicate an orgasm. My hips moved out of the shot, the camera saw only the victim's face, frosted with cream like a cinnamon roll. Surely, it must be real. Except that you can forget it, Jack, it's Chinatown. Bullets, or pain, or blood, or jism, it's just a trick. Geeks know that, rubes don't. That's the difference between being a geek and being a rube. Half blind from the chaser lights and loud music, stumbling over power cables buried beneath the sawdust between the tents, intoxicated by the awful perfumes of terror, adrenaline, and pussy, where it has to be real. Because it means something really important to him. Must be real because it looks real. In this case, we use tame cream rice. It's a perfect substitute for semen because it's pearlescent and creamy. Always available with a squeeze and a squirt, and manufacturers probably have a subliminal thing going, making it look exactly like ejaculate. Sid wasn't doing his act for the local market. He had a national, even international reputation to uphold. Creating work nasty enough to be smuggled from Europe as an example of how really depraved people can be, especially people in other countries than the United States, where we wouldn't do such things. Smuggling, I learned, was a two-way street. Sid produced his work in 16mm and smuggled it, in a manner of speaking, to Switzerland, let's say. Produced there, and duped into 8mm and dubbed over into video. PAL format, of course, to make it look like a normal regional product. Then sold to depraved American or English tourists with a taste for the real thing, the hard stuff you can't get at home. The tourists hid this sinful contraband inside their luggage or taped it to their chest as if it were a chunk of hashish like in Midnight Express. and really smuggled it in the opposite direction back into this country.